Welcome people to Free-to-Play Academy, I'm Boedewan. Today we'll be diving into the fascinating world of honkaistarrail and exploring a crucial aspect of the game, speed and turnover. So if you have ever been bewildered by how speed functions in honkaistarrail, don't worry, you're not alone. Surprisingly, the game itself doesn't provide any explanations, even though speed is arguably the most critical statistic in combat. But fear not, as this video is here to enlighten you. In this guide, we'll be splitting our discussion into two parts. The first video will cover the basics, while the second one will delve into more advanced concepts, so let's jump right into it. Have you ever wondered what speed actually is and how it operates? We'll tackle these questions head on. Furthermore, we'll explore the situations in which building speed becomes worthwhile and the characters who are most impacted by it. So without further ado, let's get started and learn about the fundamentals of speed and turnover, when its advantages to prioritize speed and how to optimize a character's speed. Join me as we embark on this exciting journey together. Alright, starting off with the basics of speed and turnover. At first glance, speed seems pretty simple. The higher a character's speed, the more frequently they can take action. A character with twice the speed of another will take twice as many turns. The game determines the turn order based on the action value, a stat displayed on the left side of the combat screen. The lower a unit's AV, the earlier they can act. Conversely, the higher a unit's speed, the lower their base AV becomes, allowing them to act more often. After a unit completes its action, its AV resets to its base AV amount. The game then decreases the AV of all units until a unit's AV reaches 0, indicating that it is their turn to act. In short, higher speed results in a lower base AV, which means less downtime between turns. Less downtime translates to taking more turns in battle. The calculation of AV and base AV, as well as methods to modify AV such as action delay, advance forward and speed manipulation, will be covered in the next video. The number to the right of each character portrait in the top left represents the current AV of each character. By default, they are invisible. To view them, you must enable the option in other settings within the settings menu. After the current combatant finishes their turn, their AV is reset to their base AV. The game then decreases the AV of all combatants equally until another combatant can act. So, when is speed worth it? There are several advantages that make speed valuable for most characters. One of the significant reasons is that certain planar ornament sets have passive effects that are unlocked only when reaching a specific speed threshold. Fleet of the Aegis and Space Tuning Stations are notable examples. Fleet of the Aegis in particular offers such a powerful effect that most characters strive for a speed of 120 just to benefit from it. Moreover, having extra actions not only increases damage and healing potential, but also improves their ability to break enemies, apply damage over time effects and trigger other useful passive abilities. However, does that mean speed is always worth prioritizing? Absolutely not. There are a few caveats that can make speed a challenging choice. Most of them revolve around the opportunity cost of investing in speed over other combat stats, although some are related to specific character interactions. The first reason why speed may not be worth it is relatively straightforward. By prioritizing speed over stats like attack percentage, critical or other valuable damage modifiers, you sacrifice some of your ability to deal significant upfront damage. While speed can provide more actions, you won't benefit from those actions until your additional speed surpasses an enemy's action value. If battles conclude before that, all the extra speed does is bump you up in the action order. For instance, 5-star speed boots may grant around 25 speed, resulting in an additional turn every 4 turns taken for most characters. Depending on when the battle ends, example cycle 3, cycle 7, cycle 11, etc., characters with approximately 125 speed may not fully utilize the value of their boots and may have preferred building stats such as critical and attack percentage instead. Secondly, capitalizing on the additional utility and flexibility provided by high speed can be challenging. To make the most of your extra turns, you need to allocate skill points and plan buffs ahead of time. Each new turn generally presents an opportunity to use a skill or gain a skill point. Mismanaging these opportunities can render speed less valuable compared to offensive stats like attack percentage. Finally, a character's role can impact how much they prioritize speed. In a team, it is generally desirable for supports to act before damage dealers to ensure that buffs are applied before the damage dealers attack. Similarly, some characters don't heavily rely on taking turns to deal damage. In the example we mentioned earlier, the 5-star boots are usually less effective for Clara and Himeko compared to 5-star attack percentage boots. This is because a portion of their damage comes from follow-up attacks that trigger regardless of the turn order. In conclusion, speed is an incredibly powerful utility stat, but its effectiveness can vary based on factors such as overall difficulty, team composition, character playstyle and enemy RNG. It's rarely a bad idea to acquire additional speed, but investing in it over other stats can have drawbacks depending on the specific character involved. This section will examine the characters who benefit the most and the least from speed. It's important to remember that wanting speed isn't always a black and white choice. There are characters who may like or dislike speed depending on the situation, as well as characters who don't prioritize building speed but appreciate it when it's obtained for free. Also, note that this is not a comprehensive review of every character in the game. Future character analysis will provide a more detailed review of speed requirements and cover characters not mentioned in this list. The list is organized into 3 categories. Characters who want more than, exactly, or less than 120 speed. The idea behind this categorization is that 2 of the best ornament sets at launch have 120 speed thresholds for their passives, so must character aim for at least 120 speed. Speed investment and optimization are complex topics. You may have heard of players advocating for specific speed breakpoints such as 134 speed for 2 turns in 1 cycle in Memory of Chaos or 125 speed for 2 cycling in Memory of Chaos. Evaluating speed breakpoints requires comparing the bonuses gained from speed through planetary ornament sets, considering Memory of Chaos cycles and enemies and assessing the impact on your character's overall stats if you hadn't heavily invested in speed. For example, pushing for 134 speed to gain 2 turns within the first cycle of Memory of Chaos is extremely valuable if you can clear the first wave immediately. However, this benefit becomes irrelevant for players who have sacrificed other offensive stats to the extent that they can no longer clear the wave. These speed thresholds continuously change depending on the content for maximum optimization. At this point in time, it's challenging to determine the necessary or truly optimal breakpoints and where they are best utilized. However, it is safe to say that keeping relics with speed subsets roles is advisable for now. On the other hand, 120 speed is generally a safe investment for certain characters. Activating planetary ornament sets can easily be achieved with just speed boots, allowing access to potent passive from Fleet of the Ages Space Ring Station or Sprite Ribbon Vacuum. High investment Bronya. If you can reach around 150 speed with a 4-piece Eagle of Twilight Line relic set, Bronya can take 2 turns before an enemy acts. This enables her to use her basic attack and immediately follow up with her skill to have a teammate advance forward. This setup effectively offsets her otherwise high SP cost and takes advantage of 100% critical rate basic attacks. Pela. With high speed and energy restoration, Pela can maintain uptime on her ultimate to debuff enemy defense. Welt. Similar to Pela, Welt prefers speed as it allows him to apply his speed debuff to enemies before their actions. Speed combined with energy restoration also enables him to use this ultimate every 2 enemy turns, maintaining the uptime on his vulnerability. Sampo. The majority of Sampo's damage comes from damage overtime effects, which scale only with attack percentage and damage percentage. As a result, critical rate and critical damage have low value for him. Instead, focus on speed, attack percentage, energy restoration and effect hit rate percentage. Reaching 120 speed is crucial for Sampo to access the Space Healing Stations and bonuses, as he appreciates any additional speed to sustain his wind shear stacks. However, attack percentage is ultimately more important than speed beyond that threshold. Qingque skill point positive. If you constantly rely on your basic attacks and rarely use your skill, there's no reason not to aim for maximum speed. More speed translates to more energy, which means more ultimates. Additionally, more speed provides more skill points for your team. Bailu. She is a bit peculiar in that she enjoys going fast but dislikes her teammates being fast. The faster Bailu acts, the more SP she generates for the team. However, when her teammates are faster, her invigoration uptime and total healing output decreases. Seele. She has an unusually high base speed of 115, which allows her to reach 120 with very few substats. Additionally, because her F turn triggers on kill, she actively seeks to front load her damage to ensure each attack hits as hard as possible. Without a signature light cone, she only needs enough speed to trigger ornament set bonuses. Asta. Her attack percentage buff decreases significantly every turn. So the faster she acts, the more rapidly the buff will decay. However, she is the primary speed buffer, so it's difficult to avoid speed altogether. Her buff provides enough speed that investing heavily in speed subsets is not worth it. Serval. She benefits from speed to maintain good shock uptime, but she also relies on attack percentage and critical for the rest of her damage. Fortunately, Serval has a relatively high base speed for a neuroadditional character, allowing you to reach the 120 threshold with just speed substats. This allows you to prioritize attack percentage boots and critical rate percentage body while still benefiting from Space Healing Station ornament set bonus. Hook. Her low speed poses a problem, especially considering how much Hook benefits from being able to follow up on her burn status effect. Without significant speed help, Hook may struggle to effectively utilize her ultimate and talent. Clara. Increasing Clara's speed reduces the uptime of her ultimate, resulting in fewer counterattacks. Furthermore, since most of her damage comes from follow-up attacks, offensive subsets like attack percentage and critical have a greater impact than speed. Qingque Tile Gacha. The more Qingque's allies act, the higher the chance of a tailing proc from RNG. The faster the allies are relative to Qingque, the better the odds. Additionally, Qingque tends to consume a lot of SP, so going too fast can leave you starved for SP. Arlan. His skill consumes 15% of his max HP each time it's used and is the source of his damage. The faster Arlan acts, the more quickly he depletes his HP, which can be detrimental unless his healer has the same speed. As a result, prioritizing increased damage for Arlan is more valuable than making him faster. Herta and Himeko. As critical-based eradicate characters, they require a significant amount of offensive stats, have a high base attack and possess slower base speed compared to other paths. All of these factors incentivize them to prioritize attack percentage boots over speed boots for better damage output. Follow-up attacks are also unaffected by speed, further reducing the need for speed stacking. While a few speed subsets are acceptable, sacrificing attack percentage and critical for additional speed is not recommended. Low investment Bronya. If you can stack a considerable amount of speed, it may be beneficial for Bronya to act before her allies by using basic attacks. Thanks to her advanced forward passive, it's generally better to either have a substantial amount of speed or none at all. Ergo, when it comes to character builds and the importance of speeds, it's essential to consider the individual strengths and playstyles of each character. While some characters benefit greatly from higher speed, others have different priorities or may even be hindered by excessive speed. Let's recap the three types of characters. First, characters who benefit from building speed. This category includes characters like high investment Bronya, Pela, Welt, Sampo, Qingque, skill point positive, and Bailu. These characters gain significant advantages from higher speed, such as increased turn efficiency, improved debuff application, enhanced damage over time effect, and better skill point generation. Reaching or exceeding 120 speed is particularly beneficial for activating powerful planetary ornament sets and unlocking potent passives. Second, characters who benefit from around 120 speed. Seele, Asta, Serval, and Hook fall into this category. These characters have specific speed thresholds that they aim for, often around 120 to maximize their effectiveness. Factors such as damage from throttling, skill uptime, debuff maintenance, and set bonus play a role in determining the optimal speed for these characters. Third, characters who benefit from less than 120 speed. Clara, Qingque, Tile Gacha, Arlan, and Herta Himeko belong to this category. These characters prioritize offensive stats like attack percentage and critical over speed, as their damage output relies more often on other factors. For some of them, excessive speed can even hinder their performance, reducing their uptime counterattacks or overall efficiency. Remember that the character analysis provided is not exhaustive and there may be other characters with unique speed requirements. As the game evolves and new characters are introduced, it's important to consider their individual characteristics and playstyles when determining the optimal speed build. By understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each character and tailoring their speed investments accordingly, players can optimize their team composition and strategies in honkaistarrail. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for part 2 of our guide, where we will delve deeper into the intricacies of speed manipulation and optimization in combat. See you soon! See you! Yes, see you soon! Bye! Mwah. See you soon! See you soon. See you soon. See you soon. See you soon. See you.